fear rules our behavior as salespeople. Fear is the strongest emotion. And if I call you on the phone, you might reject me into my ear, into my head. And that's a personal, intimate rejection. And I will do anything I can as a salesperson to avoid that from you, including picking up the phone. Because if I do so, Andy, I risk you saying no to me. And that is almost akin to death. That's how terrible a fear it is.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That was Alex Goldfayn. Alex is CEO of the Revenue Growth Consultancy and author of the new book titled Pick Up the Phone and Sell: How Proactive Calls to Customers and Prospects Can Double Your Sales. And in our conversation today, Alex makes the argument that the entire sales profession has moved away from what so many used to excel at in the past, which is making proactive phone calls to customers and to prospects. Now, in this case, the proactive phone calls defined by Alex as calling customers and prospects when nothing is wrong. And we dig into whether sellers are moving away from the phone, or is it more about how the phone is being used today? So we dig into how sellers are using proactive calling to drive revenue growth by being present, by being interested, and by demonstrating that they care. So we get into all of this and much, much more. But before we get to Alex, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it. If you could also leave us a review, give us your feedback about how we're doing. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it. Alex, welcome to the show.
Andy, thank you for having me. I sure appreciate it.
Yeah, well, no, I'm glad to have you. It's we've been trying to do this for a while, so glad we're finally able to make it happen. And so people maybe who aren't familiar with you, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. So I run a revenue growth consulting practice, and I work with business-to-business companies who average 15 to 30% sales growth by applying the things that we're going to talk about today. And individual salespeople, and I know there's a lot listening to us, often grow their sales by 50%, often double their sales by implementing these actions, these proactive communications, these proactive phone calls that we're going to talk about today.
So, I mean, those are big numbers.
Yes, sir.
So I imagine some people may be saying, okay, well, how do you do that?
Actually, the numbers, the average keeps going up because one client after another keeps exceeding the place where I put the minimum and the maximum. But I used to say 10 to 20%. And now in the last 7 or 8 months, I've upped it to 15 to 30%.
So what are these companies not doing? Maybe as a way to start the conversation, because it sounds like there's just some obvious things they must be overlooking if they're able to experience that level of growth. Yeah,
that's a good sort of hypothesis, and I think it's accurate, Andy. I think the obvious thing is most sales organizations operate totally reactively, meaning the phone rings a lot, and on the phone are customers who need something urgently or have a problem, right? Customers never call to say, hey, Andy, great job, man. That was awesome. Can I pay you more for that good work?
Very rarely. That's correct.
We only pick up the phone as customers when we need something. It's urgent enough for me to call you, right?
Now, including prospects in that as well?
Sure. Whoever calls on the phone has something urgent for you to either react to or resolve. Either you've screwed it up or they need it yesterday. And either way, here's a hoop. You got to jump through it. Either way. And you have to, because we're in the customer service business. We have to jump. So the problem with that is that's how we spend our whole day. All day long, these calls keep coming in. And this is, if it's a B2B organization, it's pretty much this way. We spend all of our time sort of dealing with these reactive, urgent, intense, often negative interactions, because that's what comes in.
If it's coming from a customer, right? You're saying if the premise is right that they only call when they have an issue, then yes.
Generally, right?
Yeah.
And so the problem is that that's only about 10 to 20% of most of these companies' customers. The other 80 to 90%, they're good. They're not calling. They don't have a problem. Nothing's wrong. Nothing's urgent enough to pick up the phone to call you. They're placing their orders, they're emailing in their orders. They're going through whatever system the orders are placed, and they're on autopilot. And they don't call us because nothing's wrong or urgent. And we don't call them because we're busy with the ones who are calling. And so these people are sort of house accounts by default, which is almost tragic because they're the best ones. They're the ones who require the least amount of time. They're the most profitable customers who need the least of you, who take the least of your time, the most profitable ones. And we talk to them the least. And so it's a very long-winded setup to answer your question, Andy. The answer is the thing most companies aren't doing is they're not really proactively communicating with those happy 80 to 90%. And that's what we start doing.
Right.
Of current customers.
Of existing customers, what you're talking about.
Yes, sir.
Which, is absolutely true, I believe. And I had a guest on the show a few weeks ago named Donna Weber, who's sort of a customer onboarding expert. And she basically states up front in her book is, she gets into why so many companies just basically ignore their customers.
Yeah. I don't think that anybody goes into it intending to ignore customers, I think it's just something that happens organically, and it sort of happens to us, because it's not like salespeople are sitting around doing nothing, waiting for the phone to ring. The phone's ringing all day long, but that's reactive work. And so I call that a reactive selling vicious cycle. And so, the thing we begin to do when I work with these organizations, and the thing that tens of thousands of salespeople that have been through my programs have start to do, is they start talking to the happy ones, to the 80 to 90%. These accounts who are on autopilot, we go to them and we say, Andy, it's Alex. How you doing, man? I was thinking about you. How's your family? And what are you working on these days that I can help you with? Because I'd like to help. Mm-hmm. And so that's just one example. And then there's many different examples we could talk about. And we get into the details like voicemails and text and what do we do and what are the mechanics. But the big picture is we start talking to people who don't hear from us very much. And we do it in system, which means if you have 10 salespeople and they can give us 3 calls a day, that's 30. And in a week, that's 150. And in a month, that's 600. And in a year, I think that's 72, what is that? 7,200. Right. 72,000, something like that. 7,200. 7,200. Yeah.
So, and just so people know, you've got a new book out called Pick Up the Phone and Sell: How Proactive Calls to Customers and Prospects Can Double Your Sales. And so you write in there that just sort of framing this discussion, you say that over the last few internet decades, you call them, that the entire sales profession has moved away from what so many used to excel at, proactive phone calls to customers and prospects.
Yeah.
So why do you think that's the case?
I think it's because fear rules our behavior as salespeople. Fear is the strongest emotion. And if I call you on the phone, you might reject me into my ear, into my head. And that's a personal, intimate rejection. Mm. And I will do anything I can as a salesperson to avoid that from you, including picking up the phone. Because if I do so, Andy, I risk you saying no to me. And that is almost akin to death. That's how terrible a fear it is. Now, the problem with that is we are in the rejection profession. You know, in baseball, you go to the Hall of Fame if you fail 70% of the time. In sales, it's more than that. You know, if you succeed 10 or 15% of the time, you're kind of one of the best, usually, in sales, in B2B sales. So We don't go to the phone because we are afraid of the no that we are very likely to receive if we go to the no. And the thing about that is every no, actually, we need to get the no's, because if we don't get the no's, we'll never get to the yeses. We have to get the no's. And if we avoid the no's, then we don't ever get to the yeses. And that's kind of how it goes.
Well, a question for you is so, yeah, I mean, I think there's certain industries where this is the case. But if you look at, I don't know, you look at the SaaS world, I mean, you can make the argument there have never been as many sellers as there are today making proactive outbound phone calls because of the whole, sales development model and so on. But, I think there's something that speaks to sort of the quality of those calls, which I think you talked about in the book. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with how the phone's being used.
There's a reviewer on Amazon from my book who wrote something I've never thought of before. They said, if the phone was invented after email, we would all think of it as a technological miracle, and we would be flocking to it.
That's interesting.
You mean somebody can hear my voice instead of just read my words on the screen? You mean I can go? You mean there's only one voicemail box and I can get into it? There's no spam folders on voicemail? That's amazing. But because email came after the phone, and when I send an email, what usually happens when we send an email in the sales process? What's the answer that we get back when we send an email in a sales effort?
None.
That's right. Right. And so when I send an email on a sale, it's probable that I'm not going to get rejected. I'm going to get silence. You get nothing. You get silence. And so if I get silence, Andy, I'm still alive, right? I'm still alive. Yeah. You're probably not alive, but in your mind,
you're still alive, right?
We convolute it to think I haven't been rejected yet. I'm not dead yet.
No news is good news.
So, yes, we have to use, your question said there's probably, it's probably about what happens on the phone. Yeah, probably. And, if you're a salesperson right now listening to this, and you can figure out how to make 3 proactive phone calls a day, which will take you 5 minutes in the mornings, because you're going to leave a message, probably. And then you're going to send a text to follow that up. And I laid this out in the book. But if you can do that, 3 calls a day is 780 in a year. If you can do that, you're going to kind of instantly be in the top 10% of all salespeople, like tomorrow.
Well, take people through the math of that, because you're making assumptions about how many people respond at one point to one of your outreaches. So walk through that.
Right. So we know the statistics, right? And thanks for lobbing that up for me. So we know that, and this is over millions of phone calls, sales call, proactive calls like we're talking about here, logged, because in my projects, we log them all into a system, and then we can go back and look at the statistics of it. Mm-hmm. And so over millions of calls logged, over 15 years or so of implementing these projects for clients, we know that if you leave a voicemail with the kind of scripts, and we could talk about them here, but with the kind of scripts that are in the book, or that we can demonstrate here later.
Well, we'll talk about it, yeah.
And then you send a text to follow that up.
When?
Right away.
Immediately. Okay.
Immediately. I leave a voicemail. Let's just go through it. And then we'll come back to the numbers. Andy, it's Alex. I was just thinking about you because I have a client similar to you, and they're doing some really interesting things and growing a lot, growing quickly. And I think some of the same things would work well for you. It made me think of it. So here's my number. I'd like to tell you about it because I think you could do it too. And then, of course, I want to catch up. And then I hang up the phone. And that's like a 18 or 19 second voicemail.
And again, so people understand, the presumption is throughout your book is that no one's going to answer. This is going to be a voicemail.
Well, no, I think I lay out plenty of sample conversations, but that was in the book. I think there's plenty of scripts and plenty of conversations laid out. But in that particular example, that was a voicemail. Right.
Okay. Yeah. Just to be clear. Okay.
Because, we could probably safely assume that, 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 5 phone calls will go to voicemail. Even if you know the person, even if you and I are buddies and we know each other, the odds of you picking up the phone are pretty low at the moment that I call.
Probably at the same odds as my kids picking up the phone when I call them. Yes.
And then I'm going to leave that message and, keep the phone in my hand and go to the text. And I'm going to say, Andy, per my VM, per my voicemail, how's your Tuesday at 2 or Wednesday at 8 to connect? And that's it. And I send it. And so statistically, we know that 2 out of 3 people will communicate back to that. They'll respond. And we also know statistically that 2 out of 3 of those are going to text you back instead of call you back. They're going to text you back.
Okay, so 2 out of the 3 they're actually going to text back. Okay, go ahead.
So 2/3 will communicate back to me. Mm-hmm. So if I make 3 calls, I'm going to hear back from 2 on average over the course of, weeks or months.
Right.
And 2/3 of those are going to text me back. 1/3 will call, 2/3 will text. And so ironically, proactive phone calls like that, they actually fill your calendar with scheduled phone calls or Zoom meetings, where you're expected to, the other person shows up and you show up and then you talk like we're doing now. So that's what we do. And, 3 calls, you said, take them through the math. 3 calls a day is 780 in a year. Things slow down. And I run my whole business on 3 calls a day, by the way. But my entire practice, I run a solo consulting practice in the book too. It's a $3 million business. I run it on 3 calls a day in the morning, first thing, because then I feel like I've worked out. I feel happy, I feel strong. And it's literally 5 minutes. That's the average amount of time it takes me to do this. Now, when things got slow during COVID, I upped it to 5 phone calls a day. So instead of 5 minutes, I went all the way to 8 or so minutes in my day, and I made my calls. And 5 calls a day is 1,300 in a year. And, I only need 1 project a month. So figure if on the 3 calls a day, that's 780. 520 or so is 2/3 of that. That's how many communications I get. What do I need? That's way more than I need. But I feel bad making any less than 3, so I make them.
Well, so let me ask you a question, because this, again, is a lot of people listening to this are in the SaaS world. We have platoons of SDRs that are cranking out, 50 dials a day. What's the advice for them? I mean, is it, that the sellers, the AEs, should be doing their own prospecting on top of what the SDRs are doing? If the AEs are just making their 3 calls a day, they're going to harvest enough pipeline opportunity to ensure they've got more than enough to hit their number? So
my process and the book, Pick Up the Phone and Sell, assumes that the 3 calls I'm talking about, or the 5, are to people who you know, as opposed to cold calls.
Okay.
Now, when you say 50 a day, I'm going to assume that most of those are to strangers. Is that a correct assumption?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So I think, and this is an interesting sort of thing that happens. So when I say, make proactive phone calls, salespeople say to me, I don't like cold calling. And then I say back to them, I'm not saying cold calling. I'm saying call people who you know. Because if you've been in sales for any amount of years, even if it's like 1 or 2, probably hundreds of people. At least, and let me tell you how this breaks down, how we can know hundreds of people. Obviously, the warmest people there are people who you've talked to, people you have a relationship with, right?
Right. Yes.
Buddies. Then one step back is people who you haven't talked to yet, but they know your name and you know their name somehow. And then one step back from that is it's people who would recognize your company name.
So the second tier that you talk about could be people you've connected with on LinkedIn.
Yeah, it could be.
Established a conversation with on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Yeah. All we need is for the person we're calling to recognize who we are or what company we're calling from when we're calling. So that it's not a cold, ice cold call. Right. We just need some sort of anchor that they say, oh, company XYZ, yeah, that's who it is. And then when you leave a message like the one that I ran through, which is, listen, I've got a customer similar to you, and they're doing something with us that I think would work really well for you. And I'd like to tell you about it because I think you can do it without me, frankly, or without us. But I think you can apply, and I'd like to run you through it because I think you'll find it interesting and it would work well for you. I would return that call. And so do tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of my clients, targets every year. Mm-hmm. And so that's how it goes. And so I think the key is that it's to people who you know, not strangers.
Right. So, but let's look at this from a perspective of, relatively new seller, within the first couple of years of the career. Yeah, don't know anybody. What steps should they be taking to get to that point you're describing?
Well, so in the book and now with you, I acknowledge that some people have to cold call. I understand, right? Some salespeople have to cold call. That said, and the book gives a process for that. That said, I think a lot more salespeople go to cold calling by default before they exhaust their options of people who either that they know or at least who would recognize them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think we default to cold calling because we don't put the time or the thought and the planning that it takes.
Right. I agree.
To call people who we know, because we don't, there's nothing in our lives really, Andy, that tells us who, the lists of people who we know that we could call about this opportunity, let's say. We have a lot of lists of names in our lives. We have emails and text messages and even CRMs. But none of those lists or resources tell us who we should call, who would recognize us this day or this week. Mm-hmm. And that takes 5 minutes of proactive, sort of quiet thinking to make a nice list. And I've got planners in the book.
Yep.
You can even categorize it if you want to. And I'll give you some examples. Customers who nobody here has talked to in 6 months or more. It doesn't have to be, we could say your customers, listeners'
Sure.
customers. Or it can just be sort of house accounts that nobody's talked to in 6 months or more. Another person is customers who used to buy from us as a company, but stopped. They've gone away. It's really hard to make a list of customers who used to buy but stopped. They're not calling us. We're not calling them. They're not in our minds. They're not listed anywhere. Nobody calls to break up. They just kind of go away. They drift away. And it takes a little planning to lay out a list of who to call. And so I think go there first. I think there's so much money and so much sales success to be had in people who you know, or that tier 2, as you put it, people who would recognize you or your company's name. That's all we need.
Yeah, I think that and I agree. I think it's a great process to sort of to be intentional with, which is problematic sometimes in sales today, is certainly again in certain industries, the sellers as opposed to the lead gen and meeting setters, oftentimes they're not asked to prospect, and which is I've had conversations with AEs at SaaS companies that are like, the company is expecting me to go out and prospect. Can you believe it? It's like, yeah. And what I like what you've written is you say, hey, here's a process. It's 3 to 5 calls a day. Who can't make 3 to 5 calls a day? Who can't put in the work that's required to identify who you should be calling? It makes it very simple.
The other day I was speaking in San Diego on a stage. I've now probably done, I think I've probably reached like double digits in live speeches in a room, and like in the last 4 months, 4 months, I'd say. I'm probably up to a dozen or so talks. And I just got back from Vegas and I did one just yesterday. I was speaking at a convention, and so this talk in San Diego a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about making phone calls, and it was a great room, and it was, energetic and enthusiastic. And I'm standing there on the stage, and I'm like, and I sort of had this like moment where I was observing myself and the audience, sort of as like this weird sort of moment,
Out of body experience, yeah,
sort of. And I said, and it's never happened before. And I said, I got to just stop my talk. And I said, I can't even believe, as I stand here, that I run a business and you all pay to come here and listen to me speak about using the phone. You using the phone, make some calls, right? And it sounds so absurdly simple, right? Beyond simple, because it is. It is so absurdly simple. That's why people start doubling their sales. Like tomorrow, you can today you're listening to this. Literally, you can start doubling your sales now. Like push the pause button, make a call now. And that's why it works, because it's so simple. I had a guy today. So this association called me, and they said, Alec, we're thinking about having you come and present this as a keynote at our event. And so we talked for a half an hour with the executive director and her programs person. And then they said, we're going to run it by our chairman of the convention. They have a chairman who runs the convention. I guess they change every time. And so they talked to that guy. And then she came back to me today, the executive director. And she said, we're going to go another direction because the chairman thinks it's too simple for our audience. It's too simplistic. And I'm like, are you freaking kidding me?
Oh no. I'm laughing because I believe that the keys to success in sales are very simple. And there's whole industries devoted to making it more complex than it's supposed to be, because that's how they make their living. But yeah, it's very simple.
If it wasn't very simple, and you know this as well as I do, it would be another reason not to do it. It would be a reason to avoid it because they're so busy. It can't be complicated.
Well, I like to say is the proof that sales is simple is that there are so many people who claim they're experts at it. Right? If so many people are experts at it, it's got to be pretty simple.
We go through an exercise because when I do these talks and these speeches, I ask, people again to get past this. How is it really same as your first question? How is it really so simple to grow your sales like this? Often it's executives or heads of sales or owners or top executives in the audience. And I say, think about the last time. Can you remember? And I'll ask you the question now, Andy. Can you remember the last time you got a proactive call from somebody who you know on your phone, who's a relationship of yours, who sells to you, who you buy from, somebody you buy from, somebody who sells a service or a product that you buy. And they said to you, like we've already practiced or demonstrated here, Andy, it's Alex. I was thinking about you. How you doing? How's your family? And you know me, so I'm asking you, I really want to know how your family's doing.
Sure.
And then I say, listen, man, what are you working on these days that I can help you with? Because I'd like to help. Can you remember the last time you got a call like that?
No, because I never have.
Now, I got one a year ago. And so the reaction is either what you just said. Most people say, no, I can't remember. Right? And then I say, but look, you run the company. You're the owner or you're the top executives. And so if somebody wants to sell to you, they need to talk to you, not the people who work for you. You're the one who signs the check. If I want to sell to you, I got to come to you. And you can't remember you said it's never happened. Now, I got one a year ago. And I remember where I was because it's like a world event.
Yeah, that's right.
I remember exactly where I was. And I remember who called me a year ago. And I remember how long we talked. We talked for about 12 minutes. I remember this.
Okay.
I remember I was holding my phone. I was so excited somebody called me like this, who I knew, which is like exactly what I do, right, in my work. And you would think people who consume all my stuff, at least they would call me once in a while. They don't. And I remember I was pacing up and down my office here, and I was holding a baseball bat, and I was so excited. And this was a year ago. And I remember what the guy's voice sounds like, Andy. And then try remembering all the emails I got that day a year ago. Try remembering the emails I got last month, like 1 month ago, or last week. Or try telling me all the emails you got yesterday. You can't. You can't do it.
You have a great line in the book. You said, if you want to be utterly forgettable, send emails instead of making calls.
And then the flip side of that is, if you want to be totally singular, if you want to be the only person in your prospect's life who who showed up and was present and was interested and cared and gave a damn, that's how you'll be perceived. Pick up the phone and call them. But if you want to be instantly forgotten and not even a thought in your prospect's head, send the email.
Yeah, so let's, in the few minutes we have left, let's talk about, because I think people that are making calls on prospects would be interested in your take on sort of, okay, great script for people that you know, that we've run through. So your script for people you don't know, or I guess maybe have some recognition of you, your tier 2 and tier 3.
Mm-hmm.
How do you avoid being pitchy?
You look for things you have in common. And you talk about those things. And I'll give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
For the last 1.5 to 2 years, we've all been living through the same crisis.
Yes. And
I can talk to a stranger who I've never met before. We can talk about that for an hour, I think. We could talk.
If you can't find common ground based on what's happened the last 1.5 years, yes, 2 years, you're not human. Yes, go ahead.
How have you gotten through? Has everybody been healthy? Has anybody caught it? What about school for the kids?
Exactly.
Have you traveled anywhere? Right. Have you been going into the office? How was it going from the office to home? Well, what about going back to the office? What's that like? Vacation and travel and hobbies, and we literally for an hour we could talk about this because there's so many layers to this, and it's such a shared experience.
Exactly.
And it's permanent.
Exactly.
It's a permanent shared experience. I was at this convention yesterday, and these people are so excited. I was just observing; they're so excited to be together. And there's this energy that didn't used to exist in previously. And you know what I think, Andy? I think that's permanent. I don't think that's going to go away.
The excitement of getting back together.
I think that we've experienced isolation now as a population, as a race of humans. And there's this gratitude and this intensity of appreciation for being together. And similarly, I think that experience that we shared over the last 1.5 to 2 years is also one that's permanently seared into our minds. And I think we can talk about elements of that forever going forward. So you look for things you have in common and you talk about them. Now, it doesn't have to be COVID. It could be somebody you both know, but you got to do that work to figure it out. It could be a supplier who you share, or a customer you both might know, or somebody who's given you a referral. And only if it has to be and you have nothing else left, you can go to LinkedIn and you can say, I noticed we have these people in common, but I don't even like that because that's what everybody tries to do.
Right. And rarely works, but yeah.
I think you could be better than that. I don't think it's hard to be better than that.
No, to your point is you'll find other things if you put in the work, but at a minimum, there's this life-changing, world-changing event we've all lived through. If you can't connect with someone on the basis of that, yeah, that's problematic.
Yeah. Agree.
And so then how do you, having made that connection now, let's take it a step further then
Sorry, a step further?
A step further, get into the business side. So how do you transition from that into the business?
Yeah, well, you pivot. So that's the opening, right? So there's three steps to these conversations. There's 3 parts. One, we open it and we connect on something personally. I was thinking about you. How are you? How's your family? How's COVID? How's any connection that you have?
And before you go on though, I just want to jump in is there's this whole school of folks in sales these days that say, that type of small talk is something, your prospects just don't have time for, which I disagree with, but I'm just interested in your take.
Well, my take is kind of twofold. One, because I'm so consistently harping on call people who and if we know each other even a little bit, I want to know how you're doing. That's an honest interest of mine.
Right.
I'm not going to avoid that because some sales guru, in air quotes, told me I shouldn't do that. I want to know how you're doing. Get out of here, sales guru. Right?
Absolutely.
Now, even if I don't know you, I'm kind of interested how our, connection might be. Do we click? Are we going to work well together? Do we like each other?
Mm-hmm.
How's the fit? And if it's just business talk, right, which everybody dives into, I think that the salespeople who dive directly into business and avoid any sort of, human interaction,
right?
I just think that that's a lack of confidence. That's a meekness. That's a discomfort for sort of, planting your feet and working on a relationship. Especially if the call has been scheduled and set up. If you're showing up proactively, I would do that very quickly. Mm-hmm. Especially if it's a cold call. All of these things everything becomes harder. Life becomes harder when it's a cold call. It's just a really hard way to live. And so that's why I think you've got to use every possible resource that you have to go to people who you know or can recognize you.
Yeah. No, I think to your point about why people sort of avoid the human connection thing, I think part of it too is there's such a barrage of information coming at them that's saying, as I said before, is don't dwell on that, don't do that. People don't have time for that. What happens is they've stopped trusting their own sort of human instincts about, well, how do you connect with another human being, right? Take it outside the work environment. If you were meeting somebody for the first time, what would you do, right? In a social setting, would you just jump right into talking about business, or you would be interested in finding some sort of common ground if there's a fit for a further conversation, whatever.
Yeah, you touched on something a few minutes ago, and it made me think of this line because I think you were kind of going here. It's not for us salespeople. This is not a difficult crowd to stand out in. It's not hard to be better than the competition, who's not showing up, who are not present, who are totally reactive, who aren't interested. It appears that they are not interested. Here's the tragedy of the whole thing. Customers want to hear from us. Customers want to know you care. Customers want you to reach out and ask them how you can help them, because nobody does that. We don't do it because we're afraid of bothering them, of annoying them, of being, seeming needy, of being one of the thousands of calls that they get. And none of that is true. And so because we don't want to bug them and we have a fear of annoying them and of losing them and of making them mad, we don't call them. But they don't perceive it that way. They don't perceive us not calling them as sort of being sensitive to their, time. You know how they perceive their salesperson not calling them? They perceive that person as not caring enough to call them. They perceive that person as not putting in the time and the effort to check in on them and to ask them what else they need. Mm-hmm. And so, we're trying to be careful, and they're perceiving it as we don't care. And so if you just show up, literally, if we boil it all away, if you're present to your customers and prospects in system consistently, so that's why 3 calls a day, they will literally look for ways to thank you with their money. They will stretch for ways to give you business. Stretch. Even business they don't necessarily need at the time. I can't tell you how many customers of my clients have told them, well, geez, we don't really need it, but we take it from you because you're just so helpful to us. You're just there. You know, people buy stuff they don't need.
Sometimes, but I think you're hoping that at a minimum is by being present is that you are, but then become top of mind when the need becomes urgent.
Yeah, and that's an important point because it doesn't matter if they need it at the moment that you call.
And I think that is when the approach on the call is always about today, as opposed to what can the buyer do for me today, as opposed to how can I help you?
That's right.
Then, you're not going to go back to them a second time. You're not going to go back to them in a month or 3 months, and when they do have a need, because I believe, and I know I'm somewhat of a minority in this, is that even though there's all these studies out that purport to show that B2B buyers don't really want to talk to sellers, I believe they do want to talk to sellers who can help them, right? They don't want to talk to sellers that are just going to waste their time, that are just completely me-centric.
I don't think that's an opinion or a research. That's not a study sort of matter. That's a fact.
Well, right. And so
that's a fact.
Well, but people see those studies and they go, oh, well, sort of an excuse for why I shouldn't be proactively outreaching or whatever. It's like, no. When a customer's talking to you, they're talking to you because they need your help. And
I think,
go ahead.
Sorry, Andy. I think it's a really important point for us. We kind of just touched on it, but I think it's important for people to sort of grasp that, the odds of the customer having an itch at the time that you show up to scratch are very low.
Yes.
That the timing fits exactly at that moment that you show up and call.
Yeah, I think there's one study sort of saying it's like 2 to 5% of the time maybe you call a customer who's quote unquote in market when you call.
That's interesting. Yeah. I haven't heard that. That's a neat statistic. Now, the key is to keep showing up.
Exactly.
And what you're doing is you're taking timing off the table then. And instead of hoping that the timing is precise in that 2 to 5% of the time, what you're doing is taking a back scratcher, and the back scratcher says Andy Paul on it, or your name on it, or your company name, and you place it onto their desk. You place the back scratcher onto their desk, and when the customer develops a need, when it starts to itch, they look at their desk and they say, "Who's the only one that's placed a back scratcher here? Who's the only one that's been showing up regularly and consistently?" And they pick it up and they scratch. And so when you show up systematically over time, you take timing off the table. And when they have a need, they will call you. They pick up the phone and they go to the one who is present. And so again, ironically, proactive calls out fill your calendar with scheduled calls. And further, they dramatically increase the number of phone calls coming into you.
Yep.
Because you're the one that people think of, because you're the only one who's been trying.
Love it. No, absolutely agree. All right, we're going to end there because that was a great ending point. You summed it up well. So people want to learn more about you and what you do. How can they do that?
Well, they can go to my website, which is my last name, Goldfayn.com. Goldfayn.com. If you'd like to read the book, it's called Pick Up the Phone and Sell. It's my second pandemic book. The one before that was called 5-Minute Selling. You can buy all of my books. I've got 6 of them. Each of the last three Wall Street Journal bestsellers.
Congratulations.
You can buy all of them at Amazon or wherever they sell books.
Perfect. All right. Well, Alex, thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy. I sure appreciate being with you.
Yeah, it's been fun. Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. As always, I am grateful for your support of this podcast. And I want to thank my guest, Alex Goldfayn, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you for your help with that. And thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.